Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending this session today. So let me just quickly share my screen. Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much for coming along today and attending my session. So the session that I'll be talking to today is an introduction to Salesforce Enterprise Architecture. So my name is Matt Bathersby. I am the head of Salesforce capability at Aware Services in Sydney, Australia. I have been working in the Salesforce ecosystem for about 14 and a half years, and I am a Salesforce CTA. So the topics I'm going to cover off today is very much an introduction to architecture. So for anybody who might be on the call who might already know about these things, this is probably not the session for you. For anybody who is interested in what these things are and wants to learn more, this is exactly the right place to be. So if this is you, hang around and we'll talk through some of these. So I'm not sure what the situation is in terms of questions, but if anybody has any questions that they want to post in the chat along the way. I don't know if we'll have time for questions at the end or if there's the opportunity to do that. But if you do want to post questions in the chat along the way, I'm more than happy to address as many of those as I can, time allowing, at the end of the session. So I want to start with a quick overview of what is enterprise architecture. So the VP of enterprise architecture at Salesforce is a gentleman called Brett Colbert, and he uses an analogy that I think is perfect for describing what enterprise architecture is, not just in the Salesforce context, but in the architecture context in general. And that is that it's attributed to or likened to urban planning or city planning. So when you think about it, an enterprise, an entire organization and a large organization is very much like a city. And if you think the different departments are almost like suburbs or regions within a city, and then within that city, you would have things like core services and infrastructure, roads, transit systems, electricity grids, water systems. There would be a plan for the city in terms of what the city looks like now and what the plan for the city is in terms of the way that would look in the future. And there would be laws, rules, and processes within the city. And so if we liken that to technology, and to the enterprise, we're talking about things like, in terms of those core services, we're talking about things like authentication, we're talking about APIs, security layers, data, that kind of thing. The city plan itself is really our strategy and our roadmap. So what are we trying to achieve? What do we want the enterprise to look like in the future? And what's the roadmap to get there? How are we going to do that? What are the issues that we're going to address first? How are we going to prioritize those things? And then laws and rules and processes, they're our standards and our governance. How do we work? How do we deliver? How do we push towards that vision, that strategy, and that roadmap? And what are the processes and procedures and the governance of how we get there? And this picture, I really like this picture. This is a picture of Barcelona in Spain, and the part that I've put the box around there in Spain. In Barcelona that's what Barcelona looked like before they put a plan into place, before they had any of these things, any of these processes, any of this governance, any of this planning. And then everything outside of that green square is after that, once they implemented those things. And Barcelona is quite famous for the fact that it's quite chaotic in that region, what they call the Gothic Quarter in that region there. And then all of a sudden it becomes very uniform. And if you get an opportunity, jump onto Google Earth or Google Maps, take a look at Barcelona from the sky and you'll see what I mean. Once those rules, once all of that governance and that urban planning and that enterprise architecture kicked in, once they had that in place, you can quite clearly see that from some satellite photos in terms of how uniform that is and how structured that is. And every block is exactly the same. It's quite nice to look at. So in terms of that unstructured or that unplanned piece that sits inside that green box, does it work in terms of a city? Does it work in terms of an architecture? Sure, maybe. Is it good? No, probably not. Is it scalable? Definitely not. Is it extensible? Definitely not. So it gets the job done. And that's not to say that without a good enterprise architecture, you can't get the job done, but you lose a lot of those benefits. You lose a lot of that ability to extend and expand and build upon in the future. So the key word really when we talk about enterprise architecture though is enterprise. We're not talking about project level architecture. We're talking about the bigger view, stepping back and looking at the entire enterprise, the entire business, and making sure that our architecture fits into all of that. And enterprise architecture, if your enterprise architecture is that everything should be done on Salesforce, that's not enterprise. So it's everything in the context of not just the organization, but in terms of the technology as well. So we can't look at enterprise architecture in the context of just Salesforce. We can't look at enterprise architecture in the context of just one project, and we can't look at enterprise architecture in the context of just a single part of an organization. None of that is really enterprise. So the key word there, definitely enterprise. If it doesn't sort of tick those boxes, it's not really enterprise architecture. You've probably gone a step lower than that. So now that we understand what enterprise architecture is, what's an enterprise architect? So typically on a Salesforce project, and there's exceptions to this, there's 100 different types of architects out there. But when looking at a Salesforce implementation, the types of architects we typically would talk about would be solution architects. Everybody knows about technical architects and data architects. So solution architects, you can see some of the things there, and this is not a complete list for any of these by any means, but the things that a solution architect would typically look at is all of the stuff that sits on Salesforce, permissions and sharing, configuration code, all of those things that you can see there. Technical architect looks a little bit more holistically, but still at that kind of project level. And then the data architect is responsible for some of the things you see there. But more importantly, the enterprise architect is really the architect of architects. They sit around the outside of those architects. They are kind of responsible for all of those things from a higher level, from an enterprise level. And often the enterprise architect would collaborate quite heavily with all of the other types of architects, and would play a very significant role in each of those different things. So all of those things that the other architects are responsible for, the enterprise architect is responsible for at some level as well. They would also oversee things beyond just the technology. They'd oversee things like not just the architecture itself or those governance processes. They would typically be involved in some level in change management. The roadmap is definitely a key part of that. C-level engagement, stakeholder engagement, having those, being in constant communication with the executives within an organization to make sure that things are on track within that enterprise in terms of the overall architecture, the vision, the goals, and strategy. There's a lot of strategy. There's program strategy, project strategy. There's a lot of strategy involved as well. Some other things that they would potentially oversee would be things like overseeing the target operating model. What does that operating model look like in terms of where we're trying to take the enterprise and the architecture within the enterprise? Things like being involved in the backlog, prioritizing what is delivered, when is delivered, and when it's delivered. A lot of things in terms of supporting business planning. So things like when releases happen, assisting with some of those governance level ceremonies, being involved in things like the architectural review board or being part of the change control board, and also resourcing to a certain degree, looking at who are the right people to have on the project at the right time based on all of those strategies and all of those plans. Really importantly, an enterprise architect needs to have a deep understanding of not just technology, but also of business. It's really, really important that somebody who is looking to get into enterprise architecture understands the way that businesses work as well as the technology. If you don't understand how a business works, it's very, very difficult to then make technology fit into business. And if you're, particularly if you're an enterprise architect or an EA, in a professional services organization where you might be implementing Salesforce or you might be implementing another solution, that understanding of business becomes even more critical because you'll be moving around. You need to very, very quickly understand a different business on every project, and every business will have different procedures, different ways of working, will have different objectives, will have different challenges. And so being able to understand the context of the business at the business level as well as the technology level is key to the role of an enterprise architect. So now we understand what our enterprise architecture is and what the role of an enterprise architect is, I want to spend the rest of the presentation talking through how to think like an enterprise architect. What are the things that an enterprise architect needs to consider in the course of a program, in the course of a project, in the course of their day-to-day job? So first and foremost, an enterprise architect needs to be really good at knowing the business, and that is, if you are an EA at an end user or an EA within a professional services organization, you still need to understand the business. So key to everything throughout this is the vision. What is the vision of the business? Where does the business want to go? What do they see the business looking like in the future in terms of the way that business is run and the types of technology they're using? Everything then that an EA does should always be driving towards and pushing towards that vision. Every single thing should be guided by the vision. And referring back to Brett Colbert, who from Salesforce, Salesforce refer to this as the North Star. So always heading in the direction of that North Star. That should guide everything that's done across the architecture of the business. Next is the objectives. What are the objectives of the business? So we know where we're going, but why? What are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes that we want? What is it exactly that the business doesn't have now that they want to have in the future? And sometimes the vision and the objectives won't align. And the role of an enterprise architect sometimes is to point that out to the business and point out the disparity between the vision that they have and the objectives they're trying to achieve, and help them steer towards or come up with a good strategy in terms of how to actually align those things and then steer in that direction. So understanding the objectives of the business, the outcomes they're looking for. What are the challenges the business has? So what is it exactly that's not working for the business right now? What is it they would like to achieve that they can't achieve at the moment? What is it that is painful for them? What is getting in their way? All of those things are challenges for the business. So it's not necessarily just what they're not doing, it's what they are doing that's not working. But understanding what it is, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are the things that are getting in our way of heading towards that vision and delivering those objectives? And then the last point there is the players. Who are the players within the organization? Who are the key people involved? Who are the people that are going to be decision makers? Who are the people that are going to be users of the system? Who are the people that are going to own particular parts of the architecture and particular technology? Who are the people who are actually going to guide us in terms of the way things need to work? There are a bunch of different players within any enterprise who will have an impact on your day-to-day role as an EA. They will either be people that you will need to present to or answer to, or people that you will need to get information from, or people that you're actually building for, the end users, the people who will ultimately use the systems and the solutions that you're architecting and putting in place. And again, all of that should always be guided by the vision of the business. The next key thing is to understand the current state. So we've understood the business, who's who in the business, what they're trying to achieve, the direction they're trying to take, the problems they're trying to solve. What does that now currently look like? What does the city look like now in terms of that urban planning? What is it exactly that we're working with? So understanding the technology landscape. What are the systems we have in place at the moment? What systems there will work in our favor? What systems potentially need to be replaced? What systems does the business want to replace? All of that will have an impact on the overall architecture in the end, and not just now, but what that architecture looks like in the future, what that roadmaps looks like. Some things might be in that landscape that are working but could work better, or that ultimately will be replaced. So understanding what are all the systems in play, what are the systems that are going to affect us, what are the systems that need to be there forever versus can go away. They're important things to know, they're important questions to ask. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So once we understand what that landscape looks like, what are the things there that are actually working for us? What are the things there that are working for us but that are ugly, that can be improved or can work better? And bad, what are the things, again, what are the things that are just getting in our way? What are the things that are holding us up from being able to or allowing the enterprise to be more efficient, and to work better? Understanding the data, it always comes down to data. So what data do we currently have? Where does that data live? What does it look like? Is it usable? Do we need all of it? Are there compliance requirements around data? There are a lot of questions that need to be asked around the data that sits within the enterprise. What data we need, where that's going to go, and what that's going to look like. Those questions will inflect things like what our integrations look like, what integrations we actually need, what kind of transformations we'll need, what kind of ESB or ETL or middleware tools will we need sitting between those environments and the solution. The data is going to play a key driver in terms of the overall architecture, and again, not just what the initial architecture looks like, but what that looks like in terms of the roadmap. And I know it seems obvious, but the other one is the business requirements. What are the current state of the business requirements? So understanding objectives, pain points, challenges, vision is great. But what does it actually need to do? What do our architecture need to do? What does it need to achieve at the grassroots level, at the bottom? So we're looking at the architecture from a very high level. But if we get into that and we look at what each part of the architecture looks like, what every part of the technology landscape looks like, what each piece of data looks like, what is it actually, what do we actually need it to do? What are the outcomes we need to achieve? How do those solutions need to work for the end users? What does the business need in terms of outputs, reportability, analytics, all of those kind of things? What are the actual requirements of the people on the ground who are using the data, who are using the systems, who are using the technologies? What does that look like? Strategies is really important. Strategies is probably the biggest piece of what an enterprise architect does or needs to, and these strategies will constantly be evolving. And there is actually a lot more than this, but there's some important questions around this. So we've talked about roadmap a little bit already. What does our architecture look like now versus what does it look like in 5 years versus what does it look like in 10 years? How are we actually going to achieve that roadmap? What is the logical way or logical process to follow and logical set of steps to actually then deliver each of those parts of the roadmap? Have we considered dependencies in terms of that plan, in terms of the roadmap? Are there things that we can't deliver in the roadmap until other things are done? Yes, there always will be, but what are those things? How do those things then affect other things further down the track? What's the viability of implementation of delivering the parts of this roadmap based on things like availability of resources within the business, budgeting, just capability across the enterprise in general to be able to deliver these things either quickly or slowly. Capability mapping is a big one, and Salesforce talk about capability mapping quite a lot in terms of some of their architectural approaches. So capability mapping is looking at what are all of those things that we've talked about in terms of the business requirements, and how do they map to the different parts of the technology landscape and to the different systems? So if we zoom in a little bit and look at Salesforce specifically, all of the different things that we as an enterprise architect have said will solve on the Salesforce platform, how do those things map to the features of Salesforce? And actually, is Salesforce even the best fit for some of those requirements? Salesforce is not always going to be the best fit for a business requirement. And so understanding how the capabilities of the landscape, how the capabilities of the different technologies that we have at our disposal map to the requirements of the business is very, very important. Resourcing strategies is a big one, and it's not necessarily the EA's responsibility for defining this across the board, but the strategy is affected and does need input by the EA in terms of what does the resourcing look like based on the roadmap, based on the implementation plan. Do we know what kind of resources we need at each point in that implementation plan? Who are the right people to make sure that that roadmap and that plan can actually be delivered the way that we want it to be delivered? Data is here again. Again, everything comes down to the data. So, what is our data? What is our data strategy? There's so many questions here around the data. What do our integration strategies look like? What about migrating data? What about transformation of data? What does that look like? Where does that need to happen? Who's going to be responsible for that? What about large data? When we're talking about a system like Salesforce, large data is an important consideration. Over time, the buildup of data in particular tables or particular objects in Salesforce can have an impact on performance. And so this stuff is important to consider straight away, right from the start. What does that look like? What are the things that we're going to do to mitigate the impact of large data? Are we going to then at some point move data off Salesforce or off the solution and into another place in a data warehouse or a data lake? What does that system look like? Is that system there already, or do we need to consider that as a new piece of technology in the landscape? Release strategy is another important one. So what's the cadence that we're going to release at? Are we going to release quickly? Are we going to release slowly? We're going to align our releases to, say, the Salesforce releases. The release strategy is an important one. There's a lot of other considerations here as well in terms of things like deployment strategies. What do our deployment strategies look like? What do our DevOps look like? What are our ways of working? How do we test? What's our methodology on the project? These are all important strategies to consider, and that an EA will be involved to some level in, or will own. All important things to consider. Solution design is really where there is probably the most overlap between the roles of the different architects in any given project, particularly a Salesforce project. So when we think about the roles of the technical architect, the data architect, the solution architect, this is really where the collaboration comes in probably more heavily than any of those other areas that I've touched on so far. So designing the right data model is very, very important. And again, I know I've said this a few times, but it all comes down to the data. Having the right data in the right place, in the right structure, can be the difference between a project that works and a project that falls over. Can be the difference between an architecture that is robust and scalable versus an architecture that has to be completely rethought at some point in the future. So the data model is important. And when I say data model, the data model when we talk in terms of Salesforce includes things like where we have master data relationships, master detail relationships, I'm sorry, that affects things like sharing and security. Those two are inherently tied. So sharing and security is another thing to consider. Who needs to access the data and when? What does that strategy look like? How do we do that? We all know there's a few different ways in Salesforce that data security and data access can be configured. There's different levers and different pulleys that will affect that. What are the right ones? Is that scalable? Does that work both now and in terms of the roadmap and in terms of the vision of the business? Is that something we can easily change if we need to later on? How do we mitigate the risk of that potentially being wrong and us exposing sensitive data to the wrong people? What's our starting point? As a best practice, data should potentially be private at all levels. But are there actually limitations that we're working with in terms of, again, our master details, our relationships, the way that data model all hangs together, where that data lives and how that data is broken up? Integrations, again, in terms of the way the integrations are designed, are key. There's always a few different ways we can solve integration requirements. So working with the data architect to understand what are the APIs, what does the technology look like in terms of the systems that we're interacting with in terms of integrations? Is there existing ESB technology or ETL technology there we can use? Do we need to consider implementing one? What are our patterns in terms of things like handling errors, in terms of retries? Do we need those? So integrations in terms of solution design, again, is fairly critical, and getting it right, getting the patterns and the frameworks in place for something like that right from the start is fairly important as well. Reporting analytics is another important one to consider. And so Salesforce, we know, has some great reporting analytics tools, but is it the right place? Is Salesforce out of the box reporting enough, or do we need to consider things like like Einstein Analytics, for example? Is there off-platform systems that we may need to use? Does that actually then tie into some of the strategies we have in terms of data as data grows? And if have we said that we're going to move data off-platform into a data lake or a data warehouse, and then does that fit into the reporting strategy that we've put in place and the design, the solution that we've designed in terms of reporting and analytics? Finally, and for me, probably most importantly, and so this is something that's quite that I'm quite passionate about, is in terms of governance, in terms of the way that we oversee projects to ensure things like quality, to ensure ways of working, to ensure that we don't miss anything, and that we maintain a high standard in terms of what we deliver and the way we deliver it. And so governing and setting those governing standards and those governing processes is a heavy part of what an EA would do, or at least be involved in. So things to consider are things like review boards, architectural review boards, design authorities. Is there something already in place there within the enterprise? Is that something we want to do? We want to introduce and do ourselves. Perhaps there's both. At Aware, we do both. Every solution that we implement at Aware, every solution design that we roll out for a customer has to go through an internal architectural review board. And that is regardless of whether or not the same thing happens on the client. This is one of the ways that we ensure the quality of our solutions. Does the organization have a center of excellence? Should we recommend one? Who are the administrators? Who's going to own the platform? How do we keep them in the loop in terms of the changes that have been made? In terms of the way the solution works, the documentation that they need. How do we recommend a system administration model, or work with the one that's already in place? Governance includes stakeholder management, working with the organization. What does that look like? How do we deal with the stakeholders within the organization? But also works the other way, about managing the relationships with the vendors. If you work for a Salesforce partner, you have both of those relationships to work with. You have to work very, very closely with Salesforce, but of course you have to work very closely with the customer as well. And there's governance and procedures that have to tie into that. Quality standards are a very, very important thing. What do those quality standards look like? What are the standards that we hold ourselves to in terms of the quality of what we do, the quality of our architecture, the quality of our solutions? Do we have a set of standardized frameworks and patterns that we use that every single person in the organization needs to adhere to? We should, but what do they look like? There's no one right answer to that. What about change management? How do we manage change? Change can be a very powerful thing within an organization, but can also be the one thing that causes a project or a program to fail. The program can be the most well-run, most high-quality program that has ever been implemented, that has ever been run. And if the change isn't managed properly within the organization, the whole thing can fall apart. Who owns different environments? How do we manage change from that respect? Who's going to own the different environments? Who's going to be responsible for implementing changes in environments? Who's going to own different pieces of technology and the changes that apply to those? What's the process that we follow for fixing defects? How do we track those? How do we know that when are they done? When is a project done? There is a lot of consideration there in terms of change management and how that actually gets managed from within a project, within a program, and across the entire architecture of an enterprise. So finally, my golden rule is to always remember that change is inevitable. Regardless of what it is that you are architecting, regardless of what the enterprise looks like today, regardless of what's been implemented tomorrow, and the changes that occur across the enterprise tomorrow, that will not look the same in a year. It will not look the same in 5 years, and it will not look the same in 10 years. Change is inevitable. Plan for the unplannable. Everything that you do as an architect needs to be with this in mind, that change will always happen. Things will always look different. The roadmap will always change. The vision will always change. The challenges across the business will always change. Every single part of what we've just talked about will change. It will flex. It will adapt. So everything that we do should aim to be scalable, configurable, should be extensible, be extendable, should be reusable. Those are some of the key things that we should be aiming for. We should never be architecting things that are rigid and inflexible. We should be aiming for the opposite. If we assume change, if we assume that every business will change, we assume that every requirement, every architecture, every technology will change, and we build with that in mind, then we'll always be able to we'll always be flexible, always be adaptable. The architecture itself will always be agile. Important thing to remember is you'll never reach perfect, because as these things change, so does the definition of perfect. But you will never get there. Don't try to aim for perfect. Do the best you can with what you have at that moment. Keep all of those things in mind and plan for change. All right. In terms of what's next, if you're interested in learning more about Salesforce architecture or enterprise architecture, there's some great resources that you can go and check out. So for anybody who hasn't already taken a look at the new architect portal that Salesforce released not too long ago, I strongly recommend it. There's some great stuff there, and they're adding more and more amazing content every single day. So go and check that out, architect.salesforce.com. TOGAF is a great, so this is the Open Group Architectural Framework. So this is a great set of standards that most enterprise architects have some level of understanding and work with. So TOGAF is a great one there to go and check out. I strongly recommend it. I've referenced Brett Colbert a couple of times throughout this presentation. He's very, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, he's very good to listen to. He's got his own Medium blog, so that's the address there, brettcolbert.medium.com. And of course, if you want to reach out to me at any stage, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. My address is there. Please feel free to connect with me, ask me some questions, or just get me in your network. I'd be delighted. So, on that note, what do we have in terms of questions?
Yes, we do have a few questions. One is from
fantastic.
Anish. So he's saying some of them are still managed by project managers also. Am I correct? Example, resourcing?
Yeah, look, a lot of the things that I just talked through are not necessarily owned by the enterprise architect, but they are things that you would need to be involved in. That they are things that they are conversations that you would be owning. So yes, you're absolutely right. Not some of those things. A lot of those things are the responsibility or owned by other people, but the EA, the architect, would definitely be involved in those conversations. Would have a lot of influence in those conversations.
Yeah. All right. The next one is: does company afford multiple types of architects for one project?
Ideally, yeah. I mean, ideally on a project you would have all the architects that you need. Now, the reality is, from a speaking from a Salesforce partner perspective, you never have enough. You never have enough resources on a project. You can always have more resources on a project, and that includes architects. So, I guess if we look at that as two separate questions, should a company have multiple types of architects on a single project? Yeah, the bigger the project, yes. And if we're talking about enterprise, absolutely, yes. The second question there, do they afford that? Can they afford that? It's probably not. It's probably not something that is done as well as it should. There should probably always be more architects, but architects are also, they're the guys that sit at the top. They're the guys who have the breadth and depth of experience that comes with a lot of But spending a long time in industry and a long time working with particular parts of technology, and so they also tend to be some of the more expensive resources. So I hope that answers the question. Ideally, you would have all of those different sorts of architects there playing their roles within a project, but that's not always the case.
All right, great. I think that's it. We don't have any more questions. There's one as well from Manish. Can you please post the links here?
Yeah, yes. Will these will we be sharing these presentations, or I'm happy
The
to
record.
post the links.
Yeah, you can post the links here as well.
Okay, fantastic. I'll post the links in the chat now, guys. But thank you very much for coming and checking out the presentation. Just one final thing. So we have recently opened an office in Pakistan, and we are always looking for amazing Salesforce talent in Pakistan. So if you're an amazing Salesforce resource and you're at all interested in working with one of the best Salesforce practices that currently exists, drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have a chat.